Welcome back to CIA Declassified. If you thought the depths of MK Ultra were disturbing, prepare yourself. Today we confront the institutional decision to abandon the material world entirely in the pursuit of espionage advantage. We are deep in the archives of Project MK Often, a heavily funded sub-project that ran during the height of the Cold War paranoia. It wasn't about drugs or electroshock, it was about sorcery, divination, and the supernatural. Our primary evidence remains the declassified file CIA-RDP81-00666R00030001-X titled quote, Occultism and Non-Conventional Behavioral Influence, end quote. This document explicitly details how the agency's technical services staff created the non-conventional consultant class, recruiting anyone who claimed access to forces beyond consensus reality, from witches and mediums to ceremonial magicians and demonologists. The context is essential. The intelligence community was gripped by the, quote, magic gap, end quote. Rumors, later partially confirmed, suggested the Soviet Union was pouring resources into psychic warfare and remote viewing. The CIA felt they couldn't risk being outmatched by the paranormal. The directive was simple: investigate any tool, no matter how ridiculous, that offered a decisive edge. The initial budget for MK Often was disguised under, quote, non-lethal psychological defense studies, end quote. The file shows that consulting fees for the occult practitioners alone reached nearly $500,000, a significant sum for the early 1970s. This was not a side project, it was a serious financial commitment driven by fear. The TSS justified it by arguing that a single successful premonition or a targeted psychological sabotage using occult belief could save billions in conventional espionage infrastructure. Let's begin where MK Often started: predictive intelligence via astrology. The file reveals that the agency created a dedicated group to hire and coordinate highly prominent astrologers. They were instructed to draw up complex natal charts for key political figures in the USSR, China, and even select domestic threats. The methodology: analysts provided the practitioners with the precise birth details. The astrologers were tasked with predicting cycles of vulnerability, health downturns, or periods of impulsive decision-making based on planetary transits. The output: these reports, compiled weekly, were given code names like celestial vectors and cross-referenced by the agency's own traditional political scientist. A quote from page 12, section beta 4, predictive correlation study. Comparative analysis suggests that while Subject A's astrological chart provided no tactical specifics, the identified periods of high stress correlated with known diplomatic outbursts with a statistical variance of less than 5%. End quote. This finding was the key to continuing the project. The CIA didn't care if Jupiter was actually influencing the target. They cared that the astrological framework seemed to align with observed human behavior profiles, often enough to warrant further study. MK Often didn't stop at predicting the enemy. It attempted to use astrology as a counterintelligence tool. The team developed a protocol to generate misleading natal charts for deep cover operatives. The hypothesis: if a foreign intelligence service was also utilizing astrology, they would receive faulty predictions about the operative's career or psychological stability, thereby delaying or misdirecting surveillance. The file labels this the, quote, reverse omen protocol, end quote. If predictive astrology was data collection, this next phase was active weaponization, active occult warfare. The document describes efforts to test the efficacy of, quote, directed malign intent, end quote, or the operational use of curses. The researchers posited DMI as a form of subconscious telepathic influence. The goal: if a ritual practitioner could project destructive emotional energy, could this induce a tangible effect like heart arrhythmias, strokes, or even fatal accidents in a target? The experiments, all controlled. The file references highly sensitive experiments in a remote facility, quote, biological targets, end quote, confirmed by later memos to include small primates, were placed in shielded cages. Recruited practitioners of esoteric traditions, including Haitian voodoo and Western ceremonial magic, performed specific malediction rituals aimed at the biological targets. The critical phase was instrumentation. Researchers attached biotelemetry equipment to the targets, measuring cardiac variability, tracking sudden heart rate changes or arrhythmia spikes during ritual performance, EEG signatures, monitoring brain wave patterns, particularly theta and delta waves in the target, looking for a, quote, disruptive signature, end quote, corresponding to the ritual peak. The results, according to the document, were inconclusive regarding direct causation. However, the data strongly supported the psychological utility. A quote from the same declassified document, page 37, Memo P9, Psychological Efficacy Model. Quote, the psychological impact of a perceived hex on a culturally susceptible subject is functionally indistinguishable from a chemical toxin. The subject's own belief system becomes the delivery mechanism for their incapacitation. End quote. This led to the primary operational conclusion. Occult sabotage. The CIA began exploring the possibility of planting occult tokens such as specific powdered compounds or ritualistic objects in the environments of superstitious foreign leaders to induce crippling paranoia in psychosomatic illness, turning the target's own cultural beliefs against them. We now confront the most ethically bankrupt part of MK Often, the search for an interrogation technique rooted in demonic possession. MK Ultra's goal was controlled mind control. The possession protocol sought to achieve total displacement of the personality. The logic, if a possessing entity could be artificially induced in a prisoner, that entity, being unbound by the subject's loyalty, could be interrogated directly. The theory, the agency sought to identify the neurological and psychological mechanics of possession, treating it not as a religious event, but as an extreme dissociative state that provided unfiltered access to the subconscious. The recruitment, the CIA specifically interviewed individuals described as exorcists and mediums to detail the precise steps, chants, and linguistic triggers used to invoke or contact entities. They were collecting operational procedure, not theology. The redacted pages, i.e. pages 40 to 55, strongly suggest human experimentation. One partially visible section references the, quote, vocal corpus collection, end quote. This was a study dedicated to analyzing the linguistic and acoustic properties of a possessed voice. Researchers compared the voice pitch, vocabulary, and grammar of subjects in a controlled dissociative state against their normal speech patterns. They were searching for a universal linguistic marker of external consciousness, a specific signature that the entity used to communicate. The goal was to train interrogators to recognize and exploit this new displaced persona. We conclude our analysis of Project MK Often. The crucial question remains, did the CIA find any actual scientific merit to the claims of magic? Final determination, the consensus documented in the final review memo is a resounding no regarding supernatural merit, but a strong yes regarding psychological utility. Supernatural claims such as magic and possession, the project failed to produce any repeatable, verifiable evidence that rituals, hexes, or demonic invitations worked outside of a psychological context. The biofeedback data, Part 3, showed that while targets reacted to perceived threats, the rituals themselves produced no measurable kinetic energy or non-conventional influence on shielded subjects. In short, magic was not found to be real. Psychological and manipulative utility, this is where the project gained merit. The agency concluded that occultism provided an immensely powerful, low-cost method for predictive profiling. Astrological stress cycles were found to be useful when combined with traditional profiling. And sabotage via paranoia, the strategic deployment of hexes and curses against superstitious targets was deemed a highly effective form of, quote, culture-specific psychological warfare, end quote. The threat of a curse was cheaper and safer than chemical poisoning. The final recommendation for MK Often was not to continue research into the occult, but to transfer the derived psychological protocols, specifically the methods of leveraging cultural belief systems to induce anxiety and distress, to the Behavioral Science Division. The agency turned a belief in the devil into a tactical manual for psychological warfare. This is the ultimate disturbing truth of the project. The agency descends into darkness not because they believed in the devil, but because they believed the idea of the devil was a useful weapon. If this documented truth has opened your mind to the technological and spiritual boundaries explored by those in power, we require your continued support. First, like this episode and leave us a detailed 5-star review. This is how the analysis exposes the deeper scientific agendas. Second, share this episode with someone obsessed with the occult, Cold War history, or the sheer strangeness of the CIA. Now, programming note for our listeners. We are exploring a phenomenon even more mind-bending than a demon in the interrogation room. We're talking about time itself. Our next episode, we will analyze the files linked to Project Cassini. This is the agency's investigation into chronological displacement and temporal perception manipulation. We'll dissect and analyze CIA document RDP88-002-0005-00002-00002-3, a file concerning the Soviet research into subjective temporal anomalies. We'll ask, what were the findings regarding the human mind's ability to experience events outside of the linear present? Did the CIA genuinely fund research into whether remote viewing could be pushed into the past or the future? And what happens when a mind gets temporarily lost? Tune in for our next episode and find out. Until then, remember, maintain your vigilance, question the shadows, and keep your critical thinking sharp. I'll see you in the archives.